As the first light of the 19th century crept over the domes and minarets of Istanbul, the Ottoman Empire stood at a difficult crossroads. What had once been a fearsome power stretching across continents now found itself weakened, its armies humbled by defeat, its lands slowly slipping away. Europe's empires were growing stronger, and nationalist movements were stirring in places the Ottomans had long ruled. But the empire did not collapse. It endured, and more than that, it adapted. Rather than fading quietly into history, the Ottomans embarked on an ambitious journey of transformation. The goal was not simply survival, but rebirth, to reshape a centuries-old Islamic state into a modern power, capable of holding its own in a world reshaped by industry, empire, and revolution. This new chapter began in 1808, when Sultan Mahmud II took the throne during a time of turmoil. Across the empire, revolts simmered from the Serbian uprisings in the Balkans to the growing independence of Muhammad Ali in Egypt. Russia loomed to the north, pressing against Ottoman borders along the Black Sea, and within, the state itself was fractured. Powerful local lords known as Ions ruled their territories with near-complete autonomy. The once elite Janissary corps, who had defended the empire for centuries, had become corrupt and resistant to change. Mahmud was patient. He began not with bold reforms, but with careful consolidation. He reached an agreement with the provincial notables, recognizing their authority in exchange for symbolic loyalty to the capital. Meanwhile, he quietly laid the groundwork for his boldest move, dismantling the Janissaries. In 1826, that moment came, when the Janissaries rose up in revolt against Mahmud's plans for a modern army. He was ready. With public support and the blessing of religious leaders, his loyal forces bombarded their barracks. The revolt was crushed, thousands perished, and the Janissary corps, long a symbol of Ottoman power, was disbanded forever. It became known as the Auspicious Incident, and it opened the door to sweeping change. Mahmud moved quickly. A new army was formed, trained in the style of European forces. The imperial bureaucracy was reorganized, traditional titles replaced by specialized ministries. The tax system was reformed, and efforts were made to curb corruption. Even Mahmud's appearance became a symbol of the times. He adopted European-style dress, trimming his beard to reflect the modern aesthetic. Yet the Sultan's ambitions were often checked by harsh realities. The Greek War of Independence, bolstered by European support, led to the loss of southern Greece. In the war with Russia in 1828, the empire suffered another heavy blow, and perhaps most dangerously, Muhammad Ali's modern Egyptian army advanced into Syria and threatened the very heart of the Ottoman homeland. In desperation, Mahmud turned to Russia for help, signing the humiliating Treaty of Ankara in Sen. Still, the spirit of reform endured. When Mahmud died in 1839, his son Abdülhamid took up the mantle. That same year, the Tanzimat era, meaning reorganization, officially began with the proclamation of the Gulhane Edict, also known as the Noble Rescript of the Rose Chamber. The Tanzimat was not a single reform but a sweeping vision. It aimed to modernize the state in every dimension: military, legal, administrative, and social. For the first time, the empire declared that all its subjects, regardless of religion, would be treated equally under the law. Life, property, and personal security were to be protected. Tax farming was abolished. Military conscription was formalized, and new courts, including secular ones, were established alongside traditional religious institutions. The architects of these reforms were men of vision and pragmatism: Mustafa Riadi Pasha, Ali Pasha, and Fuad Pasha, statesmen who had spent time in European capitals and knew the world the Ottomans now had to navigate. Their goal wasn't blind imitation of the West, but selective adaptation, choosing what worked while preserving the empire's core identity. Education became a centerpiece of this effort. New schools opened their doors, teaching modern sciences, languages, and administrative skills. The School of Civil Administration began training future bureaucrats, while specialized schools produced doctors, engineers, and officers. A new institution, the Darülfünun, the House of Sciences, laid the foundations for higher learning. A generation of young Ottomans emerged, fluent in both Islamic tradition and European thought. The legal landscape also evolved. European-inspired commercial and criminal codes were introduced. Mixed courts allowed foreigners and locals to resolve disputes. And in time, a codification of Islamic civil law, The Mesal would marry classical jurisprudence with the clarity and structure of modern legal systems. The empire's infrastructure was modernized, too. Telegraph lines stitched distant provinces to the capital. Steamships plied the waters, and railways began linking cities. Newspapers, first carefully monitored, gave voice to an emerging public sphere, where ideas could be debated, even if cautiously. On the world stage, the Ottomans won a rare diplomatic victory during the Crimean War of the 1850s. With Britain and France as allies, they pushed back against Russian advances. The Treaty of Paris that followed recognized the Ottomans as part of the European state system, a major symbolic achievement, but recognition came with expectations. A new reform edict in 1856 reaffirmed the rights of non-Muslims, a move that pleased European powers but sparked resentment at home. For all its promise, the Tanzimat era revealed deep tensions within the empire. Many Muslims felt their traditional privileges slipping away, while non-Muslim minorities often gained faster access to wealth and opportunity, especially through connections to Europe. Religious conservatives, meanwhile, feared that the empire's Islamic soul was being diluted in favor of foreign values. Still, the Ottoman Empire endured, modernizing unevenly, reforming imperfectly, and adapting constantly. The road ahead would be difficult, filled with wars, rebellions, and new political ideologies. But through the Tanzimat, the Ottomans had reimagined what their empire could be, not a relic of a fading medieval order, but a state striving to meet the challenges of a new age. As the 19th century progressed, the Ottoman Empire continued its long and complicated dance with reform. For those living in the provinces, however, these changes did not always bring hope or progress. More often than not, reform was felt as an increase in burdens, new taxes to pay, sons conscripted into unfamiliar armies, unfamiliar laws handed down from distant Istanbul. For many ordinary people, the reforms seemed less like progress and more like pressure. At the same time, the empire was being pulled ever deeper into the orbit of European economic power. Trade agreements, some dating back to the 1500s, had granted European merchants privileged terms within Ottoman markets. This made it nearly impossible for the state to protect its own industries or control its economy through tariffs. Ottoman goods became less competitive. European imports flooded in, and as the empire sought to modernize, building railways, sending students abroad, reforming institutions, it began borrowing more heavily from foreign banks. By 1875, the burden became too great. The empire could no longer pay its debts. It declared a partial bankruptcy. Within a few years, a consortium of European creditors established the Ottoman Public Debt Administration. This foreign-controlled body now managed large portions of the empire's revenue, an arrangement that brought financial stability, but also stripped away another layer of sovereignty. Yet even as the state's financial independence eroded, its intellectual life stirred with new energy. A group of writers and reformers, later known as the Young Ottomans, began to imagine a different kind of empire. Men like Namik Kemal, Ibrahim Sinisi, and Zia Pasha sought to bridge the world of traditional Islamic values with modern constitutional ideas. Through essays, poetry, and clandestine newspapers, they spoke of liberty, justice, and patriotism. They believed that the empire's survival required a deeper partnership between ruler and ruled. In 1876, amid crisis in the Balkans and pressure from within, Sultan Abdülhamid II ascended the throne. He initially embraced the reformist tide. That same year, he issued the first Ottoman constitution, introducing a parliament with representatives from across the empire. For a brief moment, it seemed the empire might follow a path of constitutional monarchy, but the experiment was short-lived. War soon broke out with Russia, and using the conflict as justification, Abdülhamid suspended the parliament after just 2 sessions. Thus began his long reign of personal rule, one that would last for over 3 decades. The Russo-Turkish War that followed was disastrous. Russian troops advanced dangerously close to the Ottoman capital before other European powers stepped in. The Treaty of San Stefano imposed severe terms, creating a large Russian-influenced Bulgaria and recognizing the independence of Serbia, Romania, and Montenegro. Although the Congress of Berlin later softened some of these outcomes, the empire still lost large swaths of territory in the Balkans, the Caucasus, and eastern Anatolia. These territorial losses set off a tidal wave of human movement. Hundreds of thousands of Muslim refugees fled their homes, resettling in what remained of Ottoman lands. The empire, now more concentrated in Anatolia and the Arab provinces, became increasingly Muslim in character. This demographic shift would have lasting effects, not just on the composition of the empire, but on its sense of identity and purpose. Despite retreating from political liberalism, Sultan Abdülhamid continued the modernization of the Ottoman state in other ways. He centralized power more tightly than ever before, using new technologies to extend his reach. Telegraph lines now connected even distant provinces directly to the palace. Railways expanded across the empire, speeding both commerce and the movement of troops. Photographs documented state achievements and reinforced imperial authority. Education remained a priority. New schools produced doctors, engineers, and civil servants trained in modern sciences and administrative practices. A generation of Ottomans grew up fluent in both Islamic traditions and European knowledge systems. Abdülhamid also emphasized his role as caliph, the religious leader of Sunni Muslims everywhere. His pan-Islamic policies reached far beyond the empire's borders, forging symbolic ties with Muslim communities in British India, Russian Central Asia, and Southeast Asia, to European colonial powers. This outreach caused unease, stirring fears of Muslim solidarity across imperial frontiers. But with these efforts came repression. Censorship tightened. Political opponents were silenced. An expansive network of spies and informants tracked dissidents. Many intellectuals fled into exile, continuing their work in cities like Paris, London, Geneva, and Cairo. Even Ottoman embassies were tasked with monitoring the activities of these exiles. From this world of exiled thinkers and underground activists, the Young Turks emerged as the next major force in Ottoman politics. Born from student movements in the empire's military and medical schools, they envisioned a return to constitutional rule. United in their opposition to autocracy, their ranks included Turks, Arabs, Albanians, Circassians, and others, all committed to reform. Over time, their network expanded into the officer corps, laying the groundwork for dramatic changes to come. Meanwhile, society itself was changing in more visible ways. The cities swelled with migrants from the countryside and refugees from lost provinces. Urban centers like Istanbul, Izmir, Beirut, and Salonika became bustling metropolises with tramways, gaslighting, and European-style boulevards. A middle class began to emerge, embracing Western fashion and habits while maintaining distinctly Ottoman values. The religious and ethnic makeup of the empire had shifted. With the Christian-majority Balkans largely gone, Muslims now formed the overwhelming majority of the population. Christians and Jews remained, particularly in urban centers, but the demographic transformation was undeniable. This raised urgent questions about what it meant to be Ottoman in a new, more Muslim-centered polity. Despite heavy censorship, the world of Ottoman ideas remained vibrant. Writers found subtle ways to discuss politics, often through allegory or historical analogy. Science and literature blossomed in new forms, blending modern thought with Islamic perspectives. Women writers like Fatma Ali began to explore questions of gender, society, and education from within an Islamic framework. By the dawn of the 20th century, competing visions for the empire's future had taken shape. Some still held to Ottomanism, promoting a civic identity that included all citizens regardless of religion. Others championed Islamism, believing that religious solidarity was the empire's truest foundation. Still others looked to Turkish nationalism, emphasizing language and ethnicity as the path forward. And in the urban centers and ports, ideas of liberalism and socialism gained footholds among workers, students, and professionals. The Ottoman Empire, by this time, was no longer a medieval state, resisting modernity. It was something far more complex, a civilization straddling worlds, struggling to adapt, redefine, and endure. In the long summer of 1908, the empire stirred with hope. From the hills of Macedonia, where Ottoman army units led by young officers rose in open defiance of the Sultan's regime, to the streets of Istanbul, where people gathered in joyful crowds, the long-smoldering discontent with autocracy had finally ignited. Sultan Abdülhamid II, seeing the threat of civil war on the horizon, chose to restore the long-suspended constitution of 1876. Elections were held, a new parliament convened, and for a brief, shining moment, the dream of a constitutional Ottoman state seemed real. Muslims, Christians, and Jews celebrated together, embracing the ideal of a shared, modern future. The air was filled with songs of unity, the flags of the empire waving alongside cries of freedom. But beneath the jubilation, old tensions remained. By the spring of the following year, counter-revolutionary forces attempted to reverse the reforms, and for a few anxious days, it seemed as though the empire might slide back into repression. Yet constitutionalist troops from Macedonia returned once more, this time not to demand reform, but to enforce it. Abdülhamid was deposed and replaced by his brother, Mehmed V, a symbolic figure who reigned under the limits of constitutional monarchy. In reality, it was the Committee of Union and Progress, the cup that now held power. What had begun as a revolutionary movement slowly hardened into a ruling party, increasingly authoritarian and guided by its own sense of urgency. As the cup tightened its grip, the world around the empire grew more hostile. In 1908, Austria-Hungary formally annexed Bosnia and Herzegovina, territories it had occupied for decades. Then came the Italian invasion of Libya in 1911, stripping away the last Ottoman lands in North Africa. And most devastating of all were the Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913, a brutal, cascading series of defeats that pushed the empire out of nearly all its remaining European territories. Cities like Salonika and Adrianople were lost. Albania declared independence. Waves of Muslim refugees fled the advancing armies, swelling Ottoman towns and villages, bringing with them trauma and resentment. The dream of a multi-ethnic empire, already strained, grew thinner. The CUP's most powerful leaders, Enver Pasha, Talat Pasha, and Semil Pasha merged as a ruling trio, determined to save what remained of the empire. But their vision was no longer rooted in shared Ottoman identity. Instead, they embraced a more centralized, Turkish nationalist approach, alienating Arabs, Albanians, and other groups who had once hoped constitutionalism would bring equality. By the early 20th century, the Ottoman Empire had been transformed. Its borders had shrunk dramatically. Its population, once richly diverse, was now more homogeneously Muslim and increasingly concentrated in Anatolia and the Arab provinces. The state machinery had modernized, centralized bureaucracy. Railways, schools, and laws bound the empire together with more cohesion than ever before. But its soul remained divided. Could the empire continue to endure in the face of foreign pressure, internal discontent, and rising nationalism? Could it become a true democracy, or would authoritarianism tighten its hold? Would the Ottoman identity, forged over centuries, remain strong enough to hold its many peoples together? These questions would not be answered by politics alone. For in the summer of 1914, history took a darker turn. As Europe teetered on the edge of war, two unfamiliar warships appeared on the horizon near Istanbul. The German battlecruiser Goeben and light cruiser Breslau, pursued by British ships, sought refuge in Ottoman waters. Their arrival changed everything. The empire, officially neutral at the time, allowed the ships to pass through the Dardanelles. The vessels were quickly purchased by the Ottomans and renamed Yavuz Sultan Selim and Midili. The German crews donned fezzes and Ottoman uniforms, but their presence was more than symbolic. It signaled a decisive shift in foreign policy. The Ottomans had not planned to enter the war. The wounds of the Balkan Wars were still fresh. The army was recovering, the economy fragile, and the people weary. For generations, Ottoman diplomacy had relied on balancing great powers, not committing to any one bloc. But the ruling triumvirate distrusted the allies. Russia remained the empire's greatest threat, always seeking control of the Turkish Straits. Britain, meanwhile, had occupied Egypt, and France had long coveted Syria. To add insult to injury, Britain had recently seized two Ottoman warships under construction in British yards. Ships paid for through public donations, a matter of national pride. Germany, by contrast, had cultivated a deep relationship with the empire. German engineers had helped build railways, including the Berlin-Baghdad line. German officers modernized the army. Kaiser Wilhelm II had visited Istanbul and presented himself as a friend to Islam. For Enver Pasha, Germany's admirer, and now Minister of War, the decision seemed clear. On August 2, 1914, a secret alliance was signed between the Ottoman Empire and Germany. It was a fateful step, and one not fully shared with all members of the government. The final break came in October, when Ottoman warships, still under German command, bombarded Russian ports in the Black Sea. Russia declared war. Britain and France followed. The Ottoman Empire had entered World War I. Sultan Mehmed V issued a formal declaration of war on November 14th, calling for jihad against the Allied powers, but the call was met with muted response, both at home and abroad. The war that followed would be the most devastating the empire had ever known. Its armies would fight from the Caucasus Mountains to the deserts of Arabia, from the waters of the Dardanelles to the gates of Suez. The struggle would claim not just land and lives, but the very heart of the empire itself. It began with a disaster. Enver Pasha led a bold winter offensive in the Caucasus, hoping to reclaim lost territory and perhaps ignite rebellion in Russian-held Muslim lands. But the campaign turned into tragedy. In the bitter winter of 1914-1915, tens of thousands of Ottoman soldiers froze to death or were lost in the snow-covered mountains at the Battle of Sarıkamış. Of the 90,000 men who set out, fewer than 15,000 returned. In the wake of the defeat, tensions in eastern Anatolia intensified. Some Armenian groups had supported the Russian advance, hoping for liberation and autonomy. To Ottoman leaders, this was viewed as betrayal. Fearing internal rebellion, the government ordered the mass deportation of Armenians from the war zone to distant provinces, particularly in Syria. What began as forced relocation soon became something far darker. Marches turned into massacres. Starvation, disease, and violence claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. Entire communities were emptied. Villages disappeared. It became one of the darkest chapters in Ottoman history, and a lasting wound that remains unresolved to this day. While exact numbers remain debated, and the topic itself continues to stir deep political and emotional currents, what is certain is this: the events that befell the Armenian population during the First World War were catastrophic in scale. Although the Ottoman government claimed the deaths were unintended consequences of wartime relocations, substantial evidence suggests centrally organized killings occurred. Many historians, and an increasing number of governments around the world, recognize the tragedy as a genocide. There were, nonetheless, glimmers of humanity amid the darkness. Some local officials, both Turkish and Kurdish, tried to shield Armenian communities. Ordinary Muslims, too, took great personal risks to hide or feed their Armenian neighbors. But these brave efforts were not enough to prevent the unfolding disaster. As horror consumed the eastern provinces, a new military drama played out along the Dardanelles. The Allied powers, chiefly Britain and France, had envisioned a bold campaign to pierce the Ottoman Straits, capture Istanbul, and open a much-needed supply line to Russia. In March 1915, they launched a naval assault, but Ottoman mines and shore batteries thwarted the attack, sinking several Allied ships. A month later, the Allies tried again, this time with an amphibious landing on the Gallipoli Peninsula. What had been intended as a swift victory descended into a grueling stalemate. For 9 long months, Ottoman defenders, under the rising commander Mustafa Kemal, repelled waves of soldiers from Britain, France, Australia, and New Zealand. By the start of 1916, the Allies had withdrawn, suffering over 250,000 casualties. Ottoman losses were even higher, yet it was a vital defensive triumph, one that lifted morale and turned Mustafa Kemal into a national hero. To the south, Ottoman forces attempted to disrupt British supply lines by launching an assault on the Suez Canal. Although their February 1915 attack failed, it tied down significant British forces in Egypt. A second, larger attempt the following year also collapsed. Britain, now on the offensive, began to push into Ottoman Palestine. In Mesopotamia, British troops advanced steadily from Basra and captured Baghdad by March 1917. But the road there had been costly. The year before, the Ottomans had achieved a rare victory, forcing an entire British force to surrender after a long siege at Kut al-Alam. Despite its many setbacks, the empire showed it could still resist. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of the war came not from a battlefield, but from the deserts of Arabia. In 1916, Sharif Hussein of Mecca launched an Arab revolt, driven by both nationalist aspirations and British promises of independence. Arab fighters rose against Ottoman authority in the Hijaz. Though the military impact was limited, its symbolic weight was enormous. With the support of figures like T. Lawrence of Arabia, and a rising Arab intellectual class, the revolt offered a competing vision of identity, not Ottoman unity, but Arab nationhood. The cracks between the Turkish nationalist government in Istanbul and its Arab provinces had been growing for years. The CUP's centralizing policies, its emphasis on Turkish language and culture, and its increasing authoritarianism had alienated many former supporters. Meanwhile, European powers were quietly drawing their own maps of the post-war Middle East. In 1916, Britain and France secretly agreed on the Sykes-Picot Agreement, dividing Arab lands into zones of influence. In 1917, Britain issued the Balfour Declaration, expressing support for a Jewish homeland in Palestine. These secret arrangements, later revealed by the Bolsheviks after the Russian Revolution, betrayed earlier promises to Arab leaders and shocked Ottoman officials. By the end of 1917, the Ottoman Empire was in freefall. Military losses had reached staggering numbers. The economy collapsed. Inflation soared. Starvation and disease became common. German influence increased as the empire leaned ever more heavily on its last remaining ally. Still, Ottoman soldiers held out on multiple fronts. In Palestine, they delayed British advances until they were finally broken at the Battle of Megiddo in September 1918. In Mesopotamia, they fought a careful, dogged defense. And in the Caucasus, the collapse of Russia allowed temporary Ottoman gains into old territories, though these too would not last. By October 1918, with the war all but lost and Allied troops advancing swiftly, the Ottoman cabinet, led by Talat Pasha, resigned. A new government, under Ahmed Izzet Pasha, sought peace. On October 30, 1918, aboard a British warship in the Aegean Sea, Ottoman officials signed the Armistice of Mudros. The empire's part in the war was over, but the peace would bring no relief. The terms of the armistice were intentionally vague, allowing the Allies broad authority to intervene wherever they saw fit. British, French, Italian, and even Greek troops began occupying Ottoman lands. Foreign warships anchored in the Bosphorus. Allied soldiers patrolled the streets of Istanbul. Though the Ottoman Sultan remained on the throne, real power had vanished. Then came the Treaty of Sèvres, signed on August 10, 1920. It was a blueprint for the dismantling of the Ottoman state. The Arab provinces were stripped away and placed under British and French mandate. Eastern Thrace and the Aegean coast around Smyrna were given to Greece. The Turkish Straits were placed under international control. An Armenian state was to be created in eastern Anatolia. Kurdish autonomy was promised, and international administrators were given control over what little remained of Turkish finances and sovereignty. What was left of the empire was to become little more than a European protectorate, a shadow of its former self. But while the Sultan's government, now powerless and under occupation, accepted these humiliating terms, others did not. In the interior of Anatolia, far from Istanbul's foreign-occupied streets, a new movement was taking shape. Its leader was Mustafa Kemal, the hero of Gallipoli. The very government that now bowed to foreign powers had sent him east, hoping he might restore order. Instead, he built a revolution. On May 19, 1919, Mustafa Kemal arrived in Samsun. From there, he traveled across Anatolia, gathering support from military officers, local leaders, and ordinary citizens who refused to see their homeland carved apart. He convened congresses in Erzurum and Sivas, laying out a clear vision, the defense of Turkish sovereignty and territorial integrity. When the Allied-backed Ottoman government dissolved the parliament in 1920, Kemal responded by forming a new one, the Grand National Assembly in Ankara. What followed was a new war, a war for independence, and with it, the final chapter of the Ottoman Empire would unfold. As Greek troops advanced deep into Anatolia in 1919, a wounded empire found its turning point not from its government in Istanbul, but from the heart of its resistance in Ankara. The Sultan's administration, tainted by its collaboration with occupying forces, had lost much of the population's confidence, but a new center of gravity was forming. Mustafa Kemal, once a commander at Gallipoli, now the leader of the Turkish national movement, emerged as the guiding figure of a rising struggle. This would be the Turkish War of Independence, not a single front, but a mosaic of conflicts, fought against invading Greek forces in the west, Armenians in the east, and French troops in the south. Alongside military battles, there was a quieter war of diplomacy. Mustafa Kemal's government worked carefully to fracture the unity of the Allied powers and gain support from the newly formed Soviet Union. Early victories in the east and south emboldened the Ankara movement. Against the backdrop of a war-weary Europe, the balance began to shift. The war's decisive moment came in 1922. Greek forces had pushed as far as the edges of Ankara, hoping to extinguish the nationalist flame once and for all. But in late August, Turkish troops launched a sweeping counteroffensive. The tide turned quickly. By early September, they had recaptured Izmir. The Greek army, routed and exhausted, retreated across the Aegean. Anatolia was, once again, under Turkish control. Tensions with Britain briefly flared over the status of the Turkish Straits, a critical neutral zone, but diplomacy prevailed. War was avoided, and an armistice was signed in the town of Madunya in October 1922. The military victories made it clear the Treaty of Sèvres, with its carving of Ottoman lands, was no longer relevant. As the Allies prepared for new negotiations in Lausanne, the Turkish Grand National Assembly took a monumental step. On November 1, 1922, it officially abolished the Ottoman Sultanate. Mehmed VI, the final Ottoman Sultan, boarded a British warship on November 17, never to return. After 623 years, the imperial dynasty that once ruled across 3 continents was no more. The Lausanne Conference began soon after, and when the new treaty was signed on July 24, 1923, it recognized something truly unprecedented: the Republic of Turkey as a fully independent nation, with borders closely resembling those of the modern state. There would be no independent Armenia, no autonomous Kurdistan. Greek territorial claims were dropped. In return, Turkey gave up its rights to former Ottoman provinces in the Arab world and agreed to a population exchange with Greece, uprooting communities and reshaping the demographics of both countries. And so, with the pen as much as with the sword, the Ottoman Empire was formally laid to rest. On October 29, 1923, the Turkish Republic was declared. Ankara, once a dusty Anatolian town, became its capital. Mustafa Kemal, soon to be known by a new name, Ataturk, the father of the Turks, was elected as its first president. Though the caliphate had been left intact in name only, it too would soon vanish. In March 1924, the institution was abolished. The final tether to the imperial past was cut. From a vast empire had emerged a single nation-state, smaller, yes, but unified in purpose and identity. The Turkish Republic, forged in war and built on reform, stood ready to chart a new path. But if the break with the past was dramatic, it was not absolute. Ataturk launched a sweeping transformation. The caliphate, once a symbol of Islamic unity, was gone. Religious schools were shuttered. Education was centralized under state control. A new civil code, modeled on European law, replaced the old Ottoman system. Women gained legal rights in marriage, divorce, and inheritance. In 1928, the Arabic script, used to write Turkish for centuries, was replaced with a Latin alphabet. The fez, once a hallmark of Ottoman modernity, was banned. The message was clear: this new republic would look forward, not back. But even in this whirlwind of change, the legacy of the empire lingered. Many of the republic's institutions, the military, civil service, and education system, had their roots in the late Ottoman period. Ataturk and his closest allies were themselves products of Ottoman schools, trained under the reformist ideas of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Even the republic's parliamentary system echoed the constitutional experiments of the empire's final decades. And though official state ideology often portrayed the Ottoman past as a time of backwardness, the people of Anatolia carried Ottoman customs, music, and language into the republic. The transformation was not a rupture, it was a reshaping. For much of the 20th century, the dominant narrative in Turkey downplayed Ottoman history. But that began to change. By the 1980s, with the country opening to global markets and new political movements, the Ottoman legacy began to re-emerge. Conservative voices, Islamic movements, and cultural revivalists looked back with interest, even admiration. They sought meaning in centuries of imperial tradition and Islamic governance-seeking roots, beyond the boundaries of modern nationalism. This revival accelerated in the 2000s, under the leadership of the Justice and Development Party. Prime Minister and later President Recep Tayyip Erdogan openly invoked Ottoman symbols. Historical anniversaries were newly commemorated. Ottoman motifs reappeared in architecture. Television dramas celebrated sultans and conquests. School curricula reintroduced Ottoman Turkish. To some, it was a challenge to the secular legacy of Ataturk. To others, a reclaiming of a rich, multifaceted heritage. As always, history remained a mirror reflecting both pride and discomfort, continuity and change. Beyond Turkey's borders, other nations also wrestled with the Ottoman legacy. In the Balkans, national memory often cast the empire as an occupier, a foreign yoke, and yet, Ottoman influence lingered in food, music, architecture, even in the rhythms of everyday language. In places like Bosnia, Albania, and North Macedonia, where Islam had taken root, the memory of Ottoman rule carried a more complex, sometimes even nostalgic tone. In the Arab world, early nationalist movements had defined themselves against the Ottoman center. The empire was portrayed as Turkish domination, suppressing Arab culture and aspirations. Yet, over time, this too began to shift. Some Arab intellectuals began to see the Ottoman centuries as a period of relative cohesion, before the fragmentation imposed by European colonialism. Especially after the Arab Spring, discussions emerged about whether Ottoman-era provinces, borders, and institutions had offered more natural foundations than those carved up by colonial hands. The echoes of the Ottoman Empire had not faded. They simply changed form, resonating through the architecture of old mosques, the melodies of folk songs, the family recipes passed down over generations, and the political debates of the present day. As the new flag of the Turkish Republic rose over Ankara in 1923, the age of sultans had ended. But the empire they had built, its grandeur, its contradictions, its gifts, and its scars continued to live on in the stories, the identities, and the dreams of millions. History, like sleep, never ends with a single moment. It fades and flows, drifts and reawakens in the past, in the present, and in what is yet to come. As we drift through the lingering echoes of history, we find the Ottoman Empire still very much alive, not in power, but in presence. Its physical legacy can be seen across the vast lands it once ruled, stretching from the shores of the Adriatic to the deserts of Arabia. In Istanbul, majestic imperial mosques still pierce the skyline, their elegant domes and slender minarets reflecting centuries of architectural refinement. In the Balkans, quiet stone fortresses cling to hillsides, watchful reminders of an empire's frontier past. Even in distant deserts, caravansaries once built for merchants and pilgrims remain, their walls whispering stories of silk, spices, and sacred journeys. City streets in places like Sarajevo, Damascus, Thessaloniki, and Baghdad still carry the imprint of Ottoman planning, where narrow lanes, shaded courtyards, and bustling markets were designed to blend practicality with harmony. In recent decades, these remnants of empire have received new attention. Restoration projects, both local and international, have helped preserve Ottoman buildings as part of a shared cultural heritage that transcends today's political borders. But the legacy of empire is not only carved in stone. In kitchens across the former Ottoman world, the flavors of the past live on. Ottoman cuisine, born in the palaces of sultans and spread through the homes of merchants and villagers, remains a defining feature of regional identity. Dishes such as dolma, vine leaves wrapped lovingly around rice and herbs, brek, crispy pastries filled with cheese or meat, baklava, with its sweet, layered richness, and kafte, spiced meatballs with countless local twists, are shared joys across Turkish, Arab, Balkan, and Mediterranean tables. Coffee, too, owes much to the Ottomans. Introduced to Europe through Ottoman lands, it became more than a drink, it became a ritual. In cafes from Istanbul to Cairo, Sarajevo to Beirut, the gentle clinking of porcelain cups still marks moments of reflection, conversation, and rest. The empire's reach extended even into language. Turkish words still echo in Arabic, Greek, and the languages of the Balkans, especially in everyday speech about food, government, and urban life. And though modern Turkish was reshaped by Atatürk's sweeping language reforms, it still carries traces of Ottoman rhythms, echoes from Persian poetry and Arabic prose woven into its roots. Religious life, too, reflects the Ottoman imprint. The empire's millet system, which allowed religious communities a measure of self-governance, influenced the way many successor states managed religious diversity. Mosques, Sufi lodges, and local shrines built in Ottoman times continue to serve spiritual life today, adapting to new nations but holding fast to old traditions. In the Balkans, Islamic customs shaped under Ottoman rule persist in unique and local forms, blending faith and history into one. But not all legacies are so gentle. Some of today's most enduring political tensions trace back to the final chapters of Ottoman rule. The lines drawn by European powers after World War I often ignored centuries of imperial administration and local identity, leading to conflicts that still resonate, from the question of Palestine to the Kurdish struggle, from Cyprus to the lingering divisions in the Balkans. Even now, the memory of the empire shapes political thought. For some, the Ottoman Caliphate is recalled as a symbol of Islamic unity. For others, especially Arab nationalists, the empire's breakup is viewed as a lost opportunity for regional self-determination. In the Balkans, memories of Ottoman rule influence how nations see themselves within the wider European project. And in modern Turkey, echoes of the past rise from time to time in the form of neo-Ottoman foreign policy, a revival, real or rhetorical, of imperial influence. Our understanding of the Ottoman world has evolved as well. Earlier Western historians often portrayed the empire through a lens of decline and exoticism, while nationalist narratives in post-Ottoman states frequently dismissed its contributions. But more recent scholarship paints a fuller, more balanced picture, one that acknowledges the empire's administrative sophistication, cultural achievements, and its remarkable ability to govern an incredibly diverse population over 6 centuries. Popular culture has played its part, from historical dramas like Magnificent Century to novels and films inspired by imperial intrigue. The Ottoman story continues to inspire imagination, even when it bends the facts. These portrayals may not always be accurate, but they invite audiences to explore a shared past, sometimes critically, sometimes romantically. Tourism has become another path to memory. Places like the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul or the iconic Mostar Bridge in Bosnia draw visitors from around the world. Culinary tourism, too, offers a taste of Ottoman life, as travelers sample recipes passed down through generations. The relevance of Ottoman history stretches far beyond its borders. Its experience managing religious and ethnic pluralism has become a point of interest in our own globalized, multicultural societies. Its diplomatic balancing act among powerful neighbors offers lessons for modern geopolitics, and its endurance through crises shows us how institutions can evolve and adapt, even under pressure. As the Republic of Turkey approaches its centenary, the relationship between nation and empire continues to shift, neither fully embraced nor completely rejected. The Ottoman legacy remains a source of pride, curiosity, debate, and reflection. In the quiet moments of the evening, beneath the glow of minarets and the hush of ancient streets, the traces of empire linger, not as ghosts, but as gentle reminders of a time when diverse peoples, faiths, and cultures lived together under one imperial sky. And as we close our eyes and drift into sleep, we are reminded that history is not just a record of what once was. It is the breath that still stirs in every corner touched by its passage. Rather than simply rejecting or wholeheartedly embracing its imperial past, modern Turkish society engages with Ottoman history in a nuanced and complex way. People selectively draw from the empire's symbols, achievements, and traditions, weaving them into today's national identity. Political leaders often call upon the grandeur of the Ottoman era, while historians carefully explore the empire's many layers, its governance, culture, and contradictions. Restoration projects bring to life architectural wonders. Yet debates continue about how the empire treated its diverse peoples, especially minorities. This ambivalence isn't unique to Turkey. Across the lands that once formed the Ottoman realm, echoes of empire linger in daily life, even as official stories may downplay their importance. From the Balkans to the Arabian Peninsula, communities wrestle with their shared imperial heritage and inheritance that crosses the modern borders separating them. Despite a century of nation-building, often defined in opposition to Ottoman cosmopolitanism, traces of imperial ways endure, quietly influencing culture, politics, and identity. The Ottoman Empire was much more than a kingdom that rose, flourished, and fell. It was a unique experiment in governance, culture, and identity, born at the crossroads of Europe, Asia, and Africa. Its strengths and weaknesses, triumphs and failures, continue to shape the region today and offer lessons for our own time. Though the empire itself is a chapter in history, its legacy lives on in the languages people speak, the food they savor, the buildings they inhabit, the faiths they practice, and the identities they embrace. In Istanbul, once Constantinople, and before that Byzantium, the empire's story is carved into the stones of the Hagia Sophia. This magnificent building has been a cathedral, a mosque, a museum, and once again a mosque. Each transformation adds a new layer of meaning rather than erasing what came before. Much like the Ottoman legacy itself, layered and complex. Throughout former Ottoman lands, beneath the surface of modern nation-states and politics, the patterns of empire remain. 100 years after its fall, we can now look at Ottoman history with a clearer eye, without the romantic nostalgia or harsh condemnation that colored earlier views. The empire was, after all, a human institution, with all the achievements and flaws that come with that. Its story deserves to be told in full, not just as a prelude to the modern nations that followed, but as a significant chapter in world history, still relevant to our present and future. From a small frontier principality to a global power, and finally to memory, the Ottoman Empire's arc is almost mythic. It began with a band of Turkish horsemen led by a visionary chieftain and stretched across 3 continents for 6 centuries. What remains when an empire fades? The borders drawn after its fall continue to shape the world, creating nations where provinces once existed. The scars of its final years still haunt collective memories, fueling conflicts and grievances passed down through generations. Descendants of its subjects live across many modern states, carrying pieces of Ottoman heritage in their languages, foods, and customs. In Istanbul, the empire's last capital, the skyline is still etched with minarets and domes, the unmistakable marks of imperial faith and ambition. The Grand Bazaar bustles in spaces first laid out by Mehmed the Conqueror. Along the Bosphorus, wooden mansions from centuries past catch the same sea breeze that once cooled Ottoman poets and passersby. But the Ottoman legacy extends far beyond Turkey's borders. In Sarajevo, Ottoman-era bridges span silent rivers, witnesses to history, including the spark that ignited World War I in Jerusalem. Walls built by Suleiman the Magnificent still embrace sacred places for 3 faiths. In Cairo, Ottoman mosques and palaces stand amid the city's rhythm. Across the Balkans, in Athens, Thessaloniki, and countless towns, Ottoman architectural elements persist despite nationalist efforts to erase them. Perhaps the most accessible part of this legacy is the food. From Turkish kebabs to Greek moussaka, Bosnian brek to Lebanese kibbeh, dishes crafted in imperial kitchens continue to flavor lives. Crossing political boundaries drawn long ago, coffee, too, remains a social cornerstone, its ritual rooted in Ottoman tradition and still shared across the region. More subtly, Ottoman approaches to governance left lasting marks on the states that followed. Centralized bureaucracy, the balancing of religious and secular authority, managing diversity, and connections between cities and rural areas, all bear traces of Ottoman patterns, even when official stories deny this continuity. The millet system's recognition of religious communities provided an early model for pluralism that influenced later forms of multicultural governance. The empire's long engagement with Europe shaped both sides. The Ottomans were sometimes Europe's enemy, sometimes trading partners, sometimes exotic others, and sometimes objects of intervention. European identity was shaped in part by opposition to the Ottoman threat. Yet Europe also adopted Ottoman cultural elements from coffee to tulips. At the same time, Ottoman modernization borrowed heavily from European models, adapting them to its own imperial context. This complex relationship continues to influence debates about Turkey's place in Europe and questions of cultural identity. For historians, the Ottoman Empire is a fascinating example of how a state can sustain legitimacy and effectiveness over vast lands and diverse peoples for centuries. How did it balance tradition with innovation, religious authority with practical governance, central control with local autonomy? Why did its reforms ultimately fail to stop decline? These questions continue to inspire research and offer insights into other complex political systems. For everyday people living in former Ottoman lands, the empire's legacy exists at many levels. Sometimes it appears clearly in heritage tourism or nationalist rhetoric. Other times, it lives quietly in cultural habits or family stories. Genetic studies reveal the mixing of populations under Ottoman rule, challenging myths of pure ethnic identities. Archaeological discoveries continue to uncover Ottoman traces, even in places where later histories tried to hide them. The empire's fall marked the birth of the modern Middle East, with all its struggles. European-drawn borders often ignored geography, economy, and demographics, creating states that still wrestle with questions of identity and legitimacy. The imperial collapse left power gaps filled by movements like Arab nationalism and political Islam. each claiming authenticity against Western influence. Most poignantly, the Ottoman Empire represents a lost world of diversity and coexistence before nationalism simplified the region. Ottoman cities were mosaics of languages, religions, and cultures mingling in daily life. Markets buzzed with Turkish, Arabic, Greek, Armenian, Ladino, and many other tongues. Mosques, churches, and synagogues stood side by side. Its governance systems recognized group identities instead of imposing uniform citizenship. This cosmopolitan reality, with all its imperfections, offers a counterpoint to later nationalist divisions. As the call to prayer echoes across ancient skylines, as artisans continue crafts passed down through generations, as families gather around tables laden with dishes born in imperial kitchens, the Ottoman past remains alive. Neither fully embraced nor entirely rejected, it is a complex inheritance successor societies still wrestle with, a ghost woven into the fabric of regional identity. Now the empire rests in history, its sultans and subjects, conquests and defeats, glories and tragedies preserved in museums and books. Yet in countless visible and unseen ways, Ottoman patterns shape life across a vast region. The flags flying over its former lands may be different, but beneath these modern borders, the deep currents of Ottoman influence continue to flow. And so, as our journey through Ottoman history draws to a close, we end, not with simple judgment, but with an invitation to understand more deeply. The empire was neither the romantic fantasy nor the dark nightmare often portrayed. It was a human institution, full of contradictions, achievements, and failures. Its story deserves to be told with nuance and respect, reflecting 6 centuries of human experience. As the sun sets over the Bosphorus, where Europe and Asia almost touched, where Constantine built his new Rome and Mehmed made his Islamic capital, the waters still carry whispers of history from the Black Sea all the way to the Mediterranean. Perhaps in these moments, we can glimpse both the grandeur and the humanity of this remarkable empire, one that rose, flourished, and fell, leaving a mark that still shapes the world we inhabit today.